For 12 years, Nia Adeyemi stood beside Korea's most feared mafia boss as the perfect, silent wife. Then he replaced her at his own table, in front of 200 witnesses, and kissed another woman. Everyone expected her to shatter. Instead, she smiled, raised her champagne glass, walked out without a word. That single night, she made one phone call to her father in Lagos, and everything Kang Tae-jun spent 20 years building began to die, quietly, invisibly, from the inside out. This is the story of the woman he forgot to fear. If this story already has you hooked, hit that like button right now, and drop a comment with the city you're watching from. I want to see how far this story has traveled. Now settle in. This one runs deep. The ballroom on the 42nd floor of the Hanseong Grand Tower had been designed to make ordinary people feel small. That was the point. Every chandelier dripping with imported crystal, every stretch of white marble veined with gold, every immaculately dressed server moving through the crowd like a ghost. It all existed for one purpose: to remind whoever stood inside it that they were in the presence of something larger than themselves, something that could not be questioned, something that did not ask permission. Nya Adeyemi had stood inside this room 9 times before. She knew exactly where the cracks were hidden beneath the gold. She arrived at 7:42, precisely 8 minutes before her husband. That had always been their arrangement. She entered first, worked the room with the controlled warmth she had spent years perfecting, greeting the right politicians, exchanging pleasantries with the right wives, positioning herself at the precise social coordinates that made Kang Tae-jun's entrance more powerful. She was the warm architecture of his public image, the human frame around his authority. She had understood this role from the beginning, and she had executed it without complaint for over a decade. Tonight she wore black. Not the soft, forgiving black of women who wanted to disappear, but the deep, absolute black of a woman who had decided something and dressed accordingly. The gown was Nigerian designed, hand-stitched with the kind of quiet craftsmanship that most people in this room would never recognize, because recognizing it would require knowing a world beyond their own. A single strand of diamonds traced her throat. Her hair was pulled back, high and severe, the way her mother had once told her a woman carries herself when she has made peace with something. She moved through this crowd, and she smiled, and she shook hands, and she remembered names. The senator's wife, who had recently recovered from a surgery she was pretending hadn't happened. The Japanese trade delegate, who preferred to be addressed by his first name in private settings. The 73-year-old widow of a former Hansong council member who always stood alone near the east windows because she had outlived everyone she'd actually wanted to talk to. Nya stopped to speak with each of them. She had always paid attention to the people in the room who other people forgot to look at. At 7:50, she felt the shift in the air before she saw it. That familiar recalibration of energy, that slight collective straightening of spines, the way conversations didn't exactly stop, but became somehow less important. She had felt this happen every year for 9 years. It meant Kang Tae-jun had entered the building. She turned, as she always did, to take her position near the entrance, ready to stand beside him, ready to be the first familiar face he moved toward in the room. She saw him immediately. He was wearing the charcoal suit she'd had fitted for him in Milan the previous spring, the one she'd chosen specifically because the cut made him look less like a man who had assembled power by force and more like a man who had been born to it. He looked exactly as she'd intended, composed, absolute. The kind of man who made rooms feel smaller simply by entering them. There was a woman on his arm. Nya had known about Yoon Sarah for approximately 7 months. She had known the way she knew most things, not through confrontation or confession, but through patient, systematic attention. The small disruptions in Tae-jun's schedule that didn't match his stated obligations. The faint trace of a perfume she didn't own on the collar of a shirt she'd sent to the laundry. A credit card transaction at a jewelry boutique on a Tuesday afternoon when he told her he was meeting with port executives. She had collected these details without assembling them into a conversation because she had not yet needed to. But this was different from a private disruption she could afford to observe in silence. Yoon Sarah was 26 years old, the daughter of a lower-tier financial consultant who had made himself moderately useful to the Hanseong Syndicate several years back. She was beautiful in the precise, assembled way of women who had been specifically constructed for rooms exactly like this one. The bone structure, the hair, the dress that probably cost more than her father made in 3 months. all of it calibrated for a particular kind of male attention in a particular kind of environment. She held Taejun's arm with the studied ease of someone who had rehearsed the gesture. Her fingers were slightly too tight on his sleeve. She was nervous. Nya registered that detail immediately and filed it away. What she did not yet register, because the full dimension of what was about to happen had not yet assembled itself in her mind, was the trajectory of Taejun's movement through the room. She noticed that he hadn't looked at her yet. She noticed that he was moving not toward the center of the room, where they traditionally stood together during the first hour of the gala, but toward the elevated section near the south wall. The reserved section. The section where the two primary seats for the host family had been set with white orchids and handwritten place cards in calligraphy she had supervised herself 3 days earlier. She watched him walk Yoon Sera to the primary table. She watched him pull out the chair on the right side, her chair, the chair that had been Naya's chair at this event for 9 consecutive years. Yoon Sera sat down. The room did not go silent. That was the first thing Naya registered. The room did not go silent because people in rooms like this had cultivated the social discipline to maintain the surface of normalcy through almost anything. Conversations continued. Glasses were raised. But something changed. She could feel it happening the way you feel the pressure shift before a storm. Something in the room's atmosphere contracting, all the invisible social antennae turning, the awareness spreading from person to person like heat through metal. 200 people had just seen it. Every politician, tycoon, crime boss, diplomat, and social figure in that room had registered what had just happened. Because the only thing people in these rooms tracked more carefully than money and power was proximity. Who stood next to whom, who sat where, who arrived on whose arm, and who was visibly, publicly removed from their position. Nya Adeyemi was still standing near the entrance of the ballroom she had helped curate, in the dress she had chosen to wear to stand beside her husband, and her husband had just seated someone else where she was supposed to sit, in front of all of them. She did not move for approximately 4 seconds. She was aware of those 4 seconds in extraordinary physical detail, the weight of her own breath, the cool pressure of the champagne flute she was still holding, the distant orchestral music that seemed suddenly both too loud and too quiet, the faint nausea in the base of her throat that had nothing to do with what she'd eaten and everything to do with the particular cruelty of being humiliated in a room full of people who would remember it forever. Then Taejun raised his glass. He looked directly at the room, not at Naya, not with acknowledgement or apology, or even the cold satisfaction of a man who had decided to make a point, but with the absolute indifference of a man who had already mentally reclassified her. And he said, in the clear, caring voice of someone accustomed to being listened to new beginnings. He turned to Yoon Sera, and he kissed her. The orchestra kept playing. Someone near the bar laughed at something entirely unrelated. Nya Adeyemi took one breath, then another. The nausea at the base of her throat sharpened briefly and then passed, replaced by something she didn't immediately have a name for, something colder and more structural than anger, something that felt less like an emotion and more like a decision being made below the level of conscious thought, the way a body decides to survive a fall before the mind is caught up with what's happening. She raised her champagne glass. She held it at precisely the same angle she had held every glass in every room for 12 years, steady, composed, the unshakable social poise of a woman who had been raised to conduct herself with dignity in rooms that did not deserve it. She smiled, not the wide, performative smile of someone concealing devastation, a smaller smile, the kind that required more control, not less, the kind that people who were watching her, and all 200 of them were watching her, would not be able to read as grief or rage or humiliation. They would only be able to read it as a woman who had already moved past this moment, a woman who was not broken by it because she was already somewhere else. She took a slow sip of champagne. Then she set the glass down on the tray of a passing server, straightened slightly, and walked with unhurried, absolute composure toward the elevator bank at the far end of the ballroom. She did not look back. She did not increase her pace. She nodded at the senator's wife she'd spoken with earlier. She paused for exactly 3 seconds to exchange a word with the trade delegate. She moved through the room the way she had always moved through rooms like this, as if she belonged in it entirely and was choosing to leave it, not being expelled from it. The elevator doors opened. She stepped inside. The doors closed. She stood in the elevator alone and pressed the button for the lobby, and she allowed herself, in the 22 seconds of descent, exactly one unguarded moment. Her jaw tightened, her eyes closed briefly, one hand pressed flat against the mirrored wall for balance she didn't strictly need, one breath that came out slightly unsteady, one moment of allowing her face to do what it needed to do without an audience. Then the elevator reached the lobby. The doors opened. Her face rearranged itself. Her chauffeur, a quiet man named Mr. Bayek, who had driven her for 6 years and knew better than to ask questions, had the car waiting at the side entrance. The night air hit her as she stepped outside, cold for mid-October, carrying the particular smell of soul at night, that layered combination of exhaust and street food and something metallic from the Han River. She got into the back seat. The door closed. The city moved past the window like something that didn't concern her anymore. She sat in silence for a long moment. Then she opened her phone, scrolled to a contact she had not called in 4 months. The name in her contacts was simply listed as Father. No last name, no title, nothing that would tell anyone who didn't already know that the man on the other end of this call was Chief Solomon Adeyemi, 71 years old, a man who had built one of the largest private financial empires on the African continent through a combination of inherited position, extraordinary intelligence, and the kind of patient, strategic ruthlessness that never required raising his voice. She pressed call. It rang twice. He picked up. Nya! His voice was the same as it always was, deep, unhurried, carrying the particular warmth of a man who loved his children without ever making that love sentimental. She heard Lagos in the background faintly. Traffic, the distant sound of something she couldn't identify. She said, "Father, it's time." A pause, not a long one, just enough for the words to settle. "I'll make the arrangements." His voice was the same. It hadn't shifted into urgency or alarm because Chief Solomon Adeyemi did not respond to information with urgency. He responded with calibration. "Are you safe?" "Yes." "Are you certain?" "Yes." Another pause. "Your brother will be on a flight within 48 hours. She said, "Tell him to bring the documentation team. It's already assembled." A beat. "Nya. Whatever you feel right now, put it somewhere where it won't interfere with your thinking. You know how to do that." She looked out the window. The city slid past. "I know. I'll call you in the morning." "Good night, Father." She ended the call, set the phone down on the seat beside her, looked out the window at the city that had been her home for 12 years, and felt something she couldn't precisely name. Not quite grief, not quite resolution, not quite relief. Something more like the feeling of having reached the edge of one thing and seeing the beginning of another, and understanding that the crossing was going to cost more than she had originally calculated. She had known, in the abstract, theoretical way of someone who is prepared for a possibility without fully believing it will materialize, that this moment was coming. The mistress had not been a surprise. The eventual public diminishment had not been a surprise. She had been raised by a man who had taught her that power reliably destroys the people who cannot imagine existing without it. And Kang Tae-jun had spent so long being untouchable that he had lost the capacity to imagine that anything he possessed could be taken from him. But knowing something in the abstract and living it in a ballroom in front of 200 witnesses are different things entirely. She pressed her hand flat against her sternum briefly, a private gesture not visible from outside the car, and felt her own heartbeat. Steady. Too steady, maybe, for what had just happened. She wasn't sure whether that was strength or something she should be worried about. Mr. Baek drove. Seoul moved past the windows. She breathed. Nya Adeyemi had been born in Lagos in the dry season, the eldest child of Chief Solomon Adeyemi and his wife, Fun Malayo, a woman who had died of a cardiac event when Nya was 11, and whose primary legacy to her daughter had been the lesson, delivered not through words, but through the example of her own life, that a woman's intelligence is the only thing in the world that cannot be taken from her by someone who has more money or more power. Funmilayo Adeyemi had been the sharpest person in every room she'd ever entered, and she had spent the first decade of her marriage carefully concealing that fact from the men around her, and then the second decade wondering why she had bothered. Nia had taken that lesson and radicalized it. She had left Lagos at 17 for London, attended the London School of Economics on academic merit, completed a master's in forensic financial analysis at 23, and spent 2 years at one of London's most respected financial investigative firms before the firm's founding partner told her, with the combination of admiration and discomfort she had grown accustomed to in rooms full of men who understood that she was exceptional but had difficulty reconciling that fact with their existing worldview, that she was the most analytically gifted person he had worked with in 30 years. She had met Kong Tae-jun at a financial conference in Singapore when she was 28. He was 36. He had introduced himself as a venture capitalist with regional infrastructure interests, which was technically accurate in the way that describing an ocean as a large body of water is technically accurate. He was brilliant, and he was dangerous, and he was the most fully realized human being she had ever been in the same room with, which was a different thing from being a good person, a distinction she had understood at the time, but perhaps not weighted heavily enough. They had been married 14 months later. She had known, walking into that marriage, that she was not walking into a clean world. She had not been naive about what the Hanseong Syndicate was, what her husband's real position within it was, what the word empire meant in this context. Her father had voiced his reservations carefully, and once, which was how Chief Solomon Adeyemi voiced reservations about anything, precisely, completely, and without repetition, trusting that she had the intelligence to hold the information and make her own assessment. She had made her assessment. She had decided to marry him anyway. She had believed at 29 that love and intelligence together were sufficient to navigate something that love alone could not. She had been right about that mostly. What she had underestimated was the rate at which power, once absolute, begins to reclassify everything around it as either useful or irrelevant. She had been useful for a long time, longer than she'd expected, honestly. She had helped manage the public face of the syndicate's legitimate business interests with a precision and social intelligence that Tae-jun had genuinely depended on. She had been his best strategic advisor in private, even as she had never been publicly credited as such. She had built relationships with the political figures, the international investors, the diplomatic contacts that had expanded his reach beyond what he could have achieved alone. She had been, in the most concrete and measurable sense, a significant structural component of the empire he was credited with building entirely by himself. And then, over the last 3 or 4 years, the reclassification had begun. Not dramatically, not through a single moment of cruelty or decision. Gradually, the way most erosions happen, through accumulation rather than event. Her opinions had been solicited less. Her presence at key meetings had been explained away as unnecessary. Her relationship with his inner circle had been slowly re-landscaped from partner to ornament, a transition so gradual that she had not been certain, for a long time, whether she was perceiving it accurately or projecting something. Yoon Sarah, apparently, was the answer to that question. Mr. Beck turned onto the private road leading to the compound. The mansion appeared through the trees. 7,000 square meters of glass and stone and immaculately landscaped grounds that Naya had spent the first 3 years of her marriage making into something that felt like a home. And the last 2 years' understanding was simply a very expensive container for a life that was no longer the one she was actually living. She got out of the car, walked into the house. The staff, 2 night attendants and the housekeeper, registered her early return with the professional invisibility of people trained not to notice anything they weren't supposed to notice. She went directly to her study. It was the one room in the mansion that was entirely hers, not designed by the same architect who had done the rest of the house, not furnished with the hyper-curated pieces that Tae-jun's stylist had selected for the public rooms. She had done this room herself, over several months, and it reflected something that the rest of the house deliberately concealed. What she actually was. The books were organized by subject, not appearance. The desk was functional, scarred at one corner from a move years ago, never replaced because she'd never wanted to replace it. A photograph of her mother sat on the corner of the desk, the only photograph of Funmilayo Adeyemi displayed anywhere in the house, because Tae-jun had suggested, early in their marriage, that it made the aesthetic of the main rooms feel inconsistent, and she had agreed to remove the others, but had kept this one here, where it was hers alone. She sat down behind the desk, opened the bottom left drawer, removed a notebook, not digital, deliberately and specifically analog, dark green cover, filled in her own handwriting with the same systematic precision she had brought to every professional task of her life. She set it on the desk and opened it to the first page and looked at what was written there. She had started this notebook 4 years ago, not as an act of revenge, not even as an act of planning, simply as an act of professional habit. She had been trained to document financial architecture. She had been living inside the most complex illegal financial architecture in South Korea for over a decade. The habit of observation and documentation was as natural to her as breathing, and she had applied it to her environment the way she applied it to everything else. What was in this notebook was the complete financial skeleton of the Hanseong Syndicate, every shell company, every offshore account, every political bribe tracked to its source and its destination, every money laundering corridor, the port acquisition structures, the entertainment company fronts, the construction company pass-throughs, the foreign investment vehicles, every hidden digital asset, every encrypted vault she had identified through patient, invisible observation of the systems her husband used when he believed no one was paying close enough attention, the routing numbers, the account codes, the names of the officials who had been paid and the amounts they had received and the approximate dates of the transactions. The corporate ownership chains that existed specifically to obscure the fact that the same man controlled all of them. 12 years of forensic precision, applied not to a client's case, but to her own life. She turned to the last page of notes she had made, 3 weeks ago, a minor update to a corporate transfer structure she had noticed shifting. And she looked at what she had assembled, and she felt for the first time since getting into the car outside the Hansong Grand Tower, something that was not grief or calculation, but something cleaner and more ancient. The particular satisfaction of a person who has been patient long enough and prepared enough, and is finally ready to use what they have built. She closed the notebook, set her hand on top of it for a moment, then she opened her laptop and began to work. She worked for 3 hours without stopping. The compound went fully quiet around her. Staff retired, security shifted to night rotation, the ambient hum of a large house in its sleeping hours settling in. She worked in the particular deep focus she was capable of when everything extraneous had been stripped away, when she was operating from the part of herself that existed before emotion and after it, in the cold, clear space where her intelligence functioned at its absolute best. By 1 a.m, she had completed the initial structural mapping of what the next phase would require. She had identified the 3 primary financial corridors that could be legally transferred under existing international corporate law frameworks, without triggering any of the criminal evidence that would alert domestic law enforcement and create complications she didn't want. She had outlined the sequence of actions that would need to be taken in order with approximate timing for each. She had identified the specific legal entities in 4 countries that her brother's team would need to engage. She saved the document to an encrypted drive that was not connected to any network Taijun controlled. She closed her laptop. She sat in her study in the middle of the night and she listened to the house around her. The sound of a house that had been her home and was no longer, the sound of something she had already left, even though she was still physically inside it. She thought about Taejun. Not with hatred. She had examined her feelings for him with the same unsentimental precision she brought to everything, and what she found was more complicated than hatred. She thought about the man she had married at 29, the man who had been brilliant and present and genuinely interested in who she was, the man who had spent their first 3 years together in a kind of partnership she had not entirely expected to find in the world she had entered. That man had been real. She was not willing to pretend he hadn't existed in order to make what she was about to do feel simpler. But that man had made a series of choices over a long period of time, and the accumulation of those choices had produced the man who had walked into a ballroom tonight with a 26-year-old woman on his arm and seated her in Nya's chair without bothering to make it private, without bothering to construct a story, without even the basic human courtesy of conducting his dismissal somewhere she wouldn't have to absorb it in front of 200 witnesses. The man tonight had done something that the man she'd married would have been incapable of, not because of the infidelity, but because of the indifference, the public indifference, the absolute certainty that she was not someone whose dignity required consideration. She had tried for 2 years to locate the man she'd married inside the one who had replaced him. She had tried with patience and with intelligence and with a generosity she was not always certain she had earned or that he deserved. She had tried long past the point where most people would have stopped. Tonight was the last night she would try. She turned off the desk lamp. The study went dark except for the ambient glow of soul through the window. She sat for a moment in the dark. Then she stood, rolled her shoulders once, a gesture her mother used to make, she realized, and felt the recognition of it land somewhere tender, and walked upstairs to the bedroom she had shared with her husband for 12 years. She undressed in the dark, got into bed on her side, set her phone on the nightstand, set the encrypted drive beside it, closed her eyes. She did not sleep for a long time. What she did, in the dark, in the silence, in the bed that still held the smell of a life that was already ending, was remember her mother telling her once. Nia had been perhaps 9 years old, sitting at the kitchen table while Funmulayo Adeyemi moved around the kitchen with the particular efficient grace of a woman who had decided that every small thing she did would be done with complete attention and complete intention. That the most dangerous thing a powerful person can do is begin to believe that the people around them exist only in relation to their power. That once that belief takes hold, she had said, without looking up from what she was doing, the powerful person has already lost the thing that made them worth being near. Nia had not fully understood it at 9. She had not fully understood it at 28 when she had watched Tae-jun across a conference table in Singapore and felt the specific electricity of meeting someone whose mind worked at a speed and depth that matched her own. She understood it now. Tae-jun had stopped believing that she existed independently of him. He had stopped registering her as a person who had an interior life, a history, a set of capabilities that predated him and would outlast him. She had become, in his reclassification, simply a component of his empire, the wife component, the image component, the social architecture component. And when he had decided he wanted a different component in that position, he had made the change with the same business-like indifference with which he restructured a corporate holding. He had forgotten, or perhaps he had never fully believed, that she was also capable of what he was capable of. That she had been watching him for 12 years with the specific, patient, trained attention of a forensic financial analyst who never stopped working, who had cataloged every vulnerability he had ever exposed, and who had been too in love with him for too long to deploy what she had assembled. She turned onto her side in the dark. The notebook was in her study. The drive was on her nightstand. Her brother would be on a flight within 48 hours. Tomorrow morning she would be downstairs at 7, dressed and composed, when Tae-jun returned from wherever he would spend tonight. She would make coffee. She would ask about his schedule. She would smile at exactly the right frequency to be unremarkable. She would be, to every observable measure, the same woman she had been yesterday. She had done it before. She could do it for however long was necessary. Outside the window, Seoul burned quietly against the dark. All those lights, all those stories, all that accumulated human weight pressing against the night. She had loved this city once. She still did, in the way you can love something and also understand that it was never entirely yours. She closed her eyes. 2 days later, at Incheon International Airport's private arrivals terminal, a tall young man in a perfectly cut suit cleared customs under the name Malik Adeyemi, declaring his purpose of visit as international investment consulting. He had a rolling carry-on, a leather laptop bag, and the particular unhurried confidence of someone who had grown up understanding that rooms full of powerful people were simply rooms. He was 27 years old. He had his mother's eyes. He had his father's patience. He had, on the encrypted hard drive in his laptop bag, everything his sister had sent him 3 hours after she'd called their father from the back of a limousine moving through Seoul at night. His phone buzzed as he walked through the terminal. A text from Naya. He came home at 4. Didn't look at me at breakfast. We're fine. He typed back. Team is assembled. We start Monday. Her reply came 11 seconds later. Don't move too fast. Let it breathe. He pocketed the phone and walked toward the exit where a car was waiting. Through the terminal's floor-to-ceiling glass, he could see the city spread out under a gray October sky. Seoul, cold and vast, and operating under the assumption that the most dangerous man in it was Kang Tae-jun. Malik Adeyemi allowed himself one small smile. He was going to enjoy correcting that assumption. In the boardroom of one of Seoul's most respected international investment consultancies, a firm that had been quietly established 3 years earlier by a holding company registered in the Cayman Islands that was, through 6 layers of corporate ownership, controlled entirely by Chief Solomon Adeyemi. A team of 7 specialists were already at work. A corporate transactions attorney from London, 2 forensic accountants from Lagos, a regulatory compliance specialist from Hong Kong, a former government contracts official from Washington who now worked in international corporate advisory. A financial investigator who had spent a decade working for international regulators and understood better than most people how legal a transfer of assets could be made to look while still being, in every practical sense, an act of total warfare. They had been briefed, they had the documentation, they had the map, they were waiting for Malik. And in the mansion on the private road at the edge of the city, in a study with a desk scarred at one corner and a photograph of a woman who had died too young, a green notebook sat locked in a drawer. Inside it, in precise, measured handwriting, was everything Kang Tae-jun had built, and everything that was about to be taken apart. Nia was in the garden when Tae-jun found her that Sunday morning, standing near the tree she had planted during their second year of marriage, a young ginkgo that had grown over 12 years into something substantial and quietly beautiful. Its fall leaves turned full gold in the October cold. She was drinking tea. She had her coat on. She was looking at the tree the way people look at things they are saying goodbye to without making it visible. "You left early Friday night," Tae-jun said. She turned to look at him. He was wearing the same suit he'd worn home at 4 in the morning 2 days ago. No tie, looking like a man who had spent the weekend deciding something and hadn't finished deciding it yet. He looked tired in a way he wouldn't admit. He looked like a man who had done something he expected to feel cleaner about. "I did," she said. "I didn't know you'd left until the end of the night." She held her tea in both hands, looked at him evenly. "Is there something you wanted to say to me, Tae-jun?" He was silent for a moment. She watched the calculation happen behind his eyes, the assessment of what acknowledgement would cost him, the instinct to retain control of every narrative, including this one. It was a calculation she had watched him perform hundreds of times in 12 years. She knew exactly what it looked like. "Things change," he said finally. She nodded once. "Yes," she said, "they do." He looked at her for a long moment, trying, she thought, to read her. He was used to being able to read her. He had been able to read her for most of their marriage with reasonable accuracy. She had allowed that. She had not hidden herself from him because she had not needed to, but something had shifted in the last 72 hours that he could feel without being able to name. Something in the quality of her stillness that was different from the stillness he knew, and she could see that difference registering in him as faint unease. Good, she thought, and didn't let it reach her face. "We'll talk properly this week," he said. It was not a question. "Of course," she said. He went back inside. She turned back to the ginkgo tree and finished her tea in silence. Malik sent her a message at 11 that morning. "First meeting tomorrow. Chung Bae-soo's investment fund. Legal transfer framework is ready." She read it, set her phone back in her coat pocket. Chung Bae-soo was the director of a mid-size infrastructure investment fund that served as one of 3 primary laundering corridors for the syndicate's port acquisition revenues. He was also, as of 6 months ago, deeply overextended on a private real estate development that had gone sideways in ways that were not yet public knowledge. He was, in the assessment Naya had written in her notebook 18 months ago, the most structurally vulnerable point in Tae-jun's financial network. He was also, as of 36 hours ago, the recipient of a private communication from a Cayman-registered holding company offering to absorb his fund's underperforming assets at a valuation that would save him from a collapse he was currently concealing from his investors. Tomorrow morning, he would take the meeting. He would not know, walking into that meeting, that the people sitting across from him represented the assembled force of Chief Solomon Adeyemi's financial infrastructure, operating through Malik's coordination, guided by a blueprint assembled over 4 years by the woman who had sat at Kang Tae-jun's dinner table and been quietly dismissed as furniture. The gold leaves of the ginkgo tree moved in the October wind. Nia stood beneath them and breathed and did not let herself feel anything she couldn't afford to feel yet. There would be time, later, for everything that needed to be felt. There was a cost to what she was doing that she understood in full and was not pretending away. The cost of 12 years, the cost of what had been real within them, the cost of the man she had loved before he had become the man who had looked through her in a ballroom and not even bothered to flinch. There was grief in this. She was not someone who operated by pretending grief did not exist, but grief was not going to stop her. In 48 hours, Chung Bae-soo's fund would begin transferring. In 72 hours, the second corridor would receive its own quiet offer. And in the study upstairs, locked in a drawer, the green notebook sat and waited. Monday came in cold and colorless, the kind of October morning that Seoul did without apology. Low sky pressing down on the city like a hand on a shoulder, the Han River gray and flat in the distance, the air carrying the particular bite that preceded rain that hadn't decided to fall yet. Nia was awake at 5:15. She had slept perhaps 3 hours total, not from anxiety. She had trained herself out of anxiety's most useless expressions years ago, but from the particular alertness of a mind that had shifted into operational mode and didn't fully power down. She lay in the dark for 20 minutes, running sequence. Then she got up, dressed, and was in her study before 6. Malik sent the confirmation at 6:47. Baesu confirmed. 9 o'clock. She typed back, "Don't let him feel pressured. Let him think he's choosing." His reply, "I know, Nuna." She set the phone down and looked at the window. Outside, the garden was barely visible in the pre-dawn gray. The ginkgo tree a dark shape against a dark sky, its gold leaves gone flat without light to illuminate them. She thought about what was happening in a conference room somewhere in the city right now, or would be happening in 3 hours, and she felt the particular cold clarity of someone who has stepped off a ledge and is no longer in the phase of the decision, but the phase of the fall, and understands that the falling is, at this point, the only honest thing. Taejun left the house at 7:30 without eating breakfast, without looking at her. He had done this twice in the last 4 days. She registered it without expression, the way she registered everything now, not as information about his emotional state, which no longer interested her, but as operational data. His attention was elsewhere. That was useful. She had staff duties until 10. A charity foundation board call at 11 that she handled from her study with complete professional composure, her voice doing the work her face would have done in the room. Warm, precise, credible. The voice of a woman who was absolutely present for this conversation and absolutely undistracted by anything else. She had always been good at compartmentalization. She had not always known that was what she was doing. Now she knew, and she was using it deliberately, and the deliberateness felt like the difference between surviving something and choosing it. At 12:15, her phone buzzed. "It's done. Full transfer framework signed. Baesu is out." She sat with that for exactly 1 moment. Then she texted, "Second corridor. When?" "Wednesday." The Hong Kong bridge structure. Taejun won't see it as connected. It's 3 layers deep. Good. Make sure the London attorney is on that call. She set the phone face down on her desk and looked at her mother's photograph for a long moment. Funmilayo Adeyemi looked back at her with the particular expression Nia had spent 30 years trying to accurately read. Not warm exactly, not stern exactly, something more complex than either. The expression of a woman who had understood that loving her daughter and preparing her daughter were the same act. "I'm doing it carefully," Nia said to the photograph, which was not something she would have said out loud in any other room. She closed her laptop, went downstairs to appear, as she did every afternoon, to be home. Park Seung-ho arrived at the mansion on a Tuesday evening under the cover of a standing security review meeting, something that happened every 3 weeks, that Taejun had long since stopped attending personally and had delegated to his household operations director. Nia had begun attending these meetings herself approximately 8 months ago, initially at the household operations director's invitation, later as a quiet fixture. No one had remarked on this because no one in Taejun's orbit had yet recalibrated their understanding of her from the category of wife to the category of threat. Park Seung-ho was 61 years old, a former military intelligence officer who had entered the syndicate's employ 19 years ago when Taejun was still assembling his initial power base. He was the last person from that original inner circle who was still standing. The others had died, been imprisoned, or had been quietly removed in the years when Taejun's consolidation had required the kind of tidying that left no paperwork. Seung-ho had survived by being genuinely useful, by being the rare variety of loyal that didn't require dishonesty to maintain, and by knowing exactly where the bodies were, sometimes literally. He was a broad man, gray at the temples now, with the posture of someone who had spent years in rooms where a slouch could get you killed and hadn't been able to fully decompress since. He moved through the world with a perpetual watchfulness that people often misread as aggression. It was not aggression, it was the habit of a man who had spent 40 years paying attention to things other people chose not to see. He had been paying attention to Nia Adeyemi for 3 years, They sat in the garden, not inside, because the inside of the mansion had ears, and they both knew it. The outdoor furniture was teak, solid, placed near the east garden wall where the security cameras had a 17-second rotation gap that Seung-ho had known about for 2 years and had chosen, until now, not to report to anyone. He set a cup of coffee down on the table between them and looked at her with the direct, unsentimental appraisal of a man who had long ago stopped having the patience for pretense. "Friday night," he said. "Yes," she said. "I was there." "I know you were." He was quiet for a moment, looked at his coffee. "I've worked for him for 19 years. He said it without apparent emotion, the way people state facts they have made peace with. "I've done things for him that I understood the weight of at the time and did anyway. I'm not standing here pretending I'm a clean man. I haven't asked you to pretend anything." "No." He looked up. "That's part of why I'm here." He set both hands flat on the table, a gesture that felt like someone putting down something they'd been carrying. He's been wrong before. I've watched him be wrong. I've watched him lose perspective on people, write off people who were holding up parts of the structure he didn't see because he didn't want to see them. A pause. But Friday was different. What he did Friday, that wasn't a man making a tactical error. That was a man who has stopped believing there are any consequences for him. Nia looked at him steadily. "Why are you telling me this?" "Because you're not just the wronged wife." He said it flatly, without apology for the bluntness. "I've watched you for 3 years. I know what you are. I know what you've been doing." He held her gaze. "I don't know how far along you are, but I know you're somewhere. And I'm telling you that whatever you're building, there's a piece you're missing." Her pulse moved slightly faster. She did not let it reach her face. "What piece?" Seung-ho reached inside his jacket, removed a small drive, matte black, no markings, the size of a thumb. Set it on the table between them. Did not take his hand off it yet. "He has an insurance vault," he said. "Digital, encrypted. Off-site server infrastructure that's not connected to any of the holding networks you'll be able to access through the financial architecture." He paused. "It contains everything he's collected on everyone for 20 years. Political officials, law enforcement, competing syndicate leaders, international partners, leverage files, transaction records that aren't in any public or corporate registry. Some of it's insurance against the people he works with. Some of it's insurance against the people he works for. All of it is the reason he's been untouchable." Nya looked at the drive, then at him. "Why?" she said. "Simple. Direct." He was quiet for a moment that felt longer than it was. "He has a son," Seung-ho said finally. 22 years old. Not from his marriage? Not from this situation either. From a woman who was not given a choice about what happened to her 12 years ago and who has been kept quiet since. The boy's name is Kang Jun. He lives in Busan. He doesn't know who his father is." A breath. "I've made sure of that. I've been making sure of that for 12 years because the alternative was him growing up as leverage." His jaw tightened almost imperceptibly. "I'm done protecting a man whose empire functions on the silencing of people who can't protect themselves." The garden was very quiet. Somewhere beyond the wall, the city hummed its permanent low frequency. A leaf from the ginkgo tree moved across the stone paving between them and stopped. Nia looked at Seung-ho for a long moment. Long enough to satisfy herself that what she was seeing in him was real. Not a test, not a trap, not a performance engineered by a man still fundamentally loyal to Taejun. She had been reading people all her life. She had been reading rooms and intentions and the specific quality of honesty that exists in people who have reached their own limits and are past performing. She read him now with everything she had. She reached out and picked up the drive. "Location of the vault?" she said. He told her. 3 sentences. She committed them to memory and did not write them down. "The encryption?" she asked. "Your brother's team will be able to break it. I've seen what they're working with. It'll take 2 days, maybe 3. He paused. "Once it's accessed, it needs to be copied before any alert is triggered. The vault has a 20-minute access window before it sends an automated security ping to 3 of his trusted people. One of them is me. And when the ping arrives, I won't respond to it." She looked at him. "That's going to cost you." "I know what it's going to cost me." He said it with the quietness of someone who has done the math and accepted the number. I've been at this table for 19 years. I know exactly what I'm walking away from. He picked up his coffee, drank, set it down. Get him out of Seoul cleanly. Don't let it turn bloody. That's all I'm asking. It won't turn bloody, she said. That was never the plan. He nodded once, the single nod of a man who has decided and is done reconsidering. Then we understand each other. They sat for another few minutes in the garden, not speaking much, finishing their coffee like two people who had simply met to discuss the weather. When Seong-ho left, she remained in the garden alone and felt the weight of what had just shifted. The vault had been the one piece she hadn't been able to locate through financial mapping alone, the one blind spot in her otherwise comprehensive blueprint, and now it was in reach. She texted Malik that night with 2 words and a set of coordinates. Add this. His response took 4 minutes. She imagined him reading it, recalibrating, understanding what it meant for the sequence. That changes the timeline. We can move faster. She wrote back, no, we hold the sequence. Let it breathe. She said that a lot. Let it breathe. It was the hardest discipline in any long operation, the resistance to acceleration once you could feel the momentum building, the understanding that the impulse to move faster when things were working was exactly when the most catastrophic errors got made. Her father had taught her that. He had also taught her that the second most dangerous moment in any strategic action was not the beginning, when you were still uncertain, but the middle, when you were certain enough to get careless. She was not going to get careless. On Thursday morning, 3 days after Seong-ho's visit, Kang Tae-jun called an emergency meeting of his senior financial team. Nia knew about it 4 hours before it happened because she had, over the course of 12 years, developed a comprehensive understanding of which of her husband's staff communicated with which other members of his staff through which channels, and she had long ago identified the particular assistant, a meticulous young man named Kim Dong-won who handled Tae-jun's scheduling and who was also, through no fault of his own, deeply in debt to a private lending structure that was managed by a company connected to Chief Solomon Adeyemi's holding network, who would reliably inform her of significant schedule changes without being fully aware of why he was doing so. She was in the kitchen when Tae-jun came downstairs looking like a man who hadn't slept and was trying to project the appearance of a man who had. His suit was correct. His posture was correct. His eyes were not. Something's wrong with the Busan fund structure, he said to her, which was not something he had said to her about operational matters in 2 years. The fact that he was saying it now told her more than the words themselves. He was looking, without knowing he was looking, for the particular quality of attention she had always brought to his problems. The attention he had spent the last several years not asking for, and was now, in the early stages of real uncertainty, reaching for instinctively. She looked up from the newspaper she wasn't reading. What kind of problem? Chung Bae-soo's fund submitted a restructuring notice. His lead assets are being transferred to an international holding entity I've never heard of. He was watching her. My legal team is trying to identify the ownership chain. She kept her face neutral. Let it sit for 2 seconds, not long enough to be evasive, exactly long enough to be someone thinking. Bae-soo has been overextended for a while, you knew that. Not this overextended. He was still watching her with the particular focused attention of a man who is starting to ask himself questions he doesn't have the right question for yet. It's moving fast, legally clean. That's what bothers me. Do you want me to ask someone I know from the LSE's regulatory network? I still have contacts in London compliance circles. He looked at her for a moment. She held the look without flinching, without smiling, without doing anything that would read as performance. Just a wife offering the things she could offer, the way she always had, the way he'd stopped accepting a long time ago. I'll handle it, he said, and left. She waited until she heard his car leave the drive. Then she set down the newspaper and sat for a moment in the kitchen that had been her kitchen for 12 years, with the gray October light coming in through the windows she had chosen during the renovation in their 3rd year, and she allowed herself to feel the particular sharpness of what was happening. Not guilt, precisely, but the weight of intimacy weaponized, the strange grief of using someone's trust against them even when they had long since stopped deserving it. Then she called Malik. He's noticed Bae-soo, she said. Already? That's a pause. His legal team is faster than I expected. Move up the vault access. Not the other transfers, those stay on schedule. But the vault needs to happen before his legal team traces the ownership chain far enough to start asking the right questions. Silence on the line. She could hear Malik thinking, the particular quality of her brother's silence that she had known since he was 7 years old, and working out a math problem at their father's desk. That's a compressed window. Seung-ho said 2 to 3 days for the encryption. Tell the team they have 36 hours. Nya, Malik. Her voice was level. 36 hours. Another pause, then. All right. The vault was accessed at 11:47 on a Friday night, exactly 1 week after the gala, a symmetry she had not planned and did not find satisfying. She was in her study when Malik sent the confirmation. She was wearing the same robe she'd worn every Friday night for years, because maintaining the rhythms of ordinary life was part of the discipline, because ordinary life was the cover and the cover was everything. Vault accessed. Copying initiated. Clock is running. She set the phone face up on her desk and watched the minutes. 18 minutes and 40 seconds. She did not move. She did not drink the tea that was cooling beside her hand. She watched the phone with the focused stillness of someone who has trained themselves not to let urgency express itself in useless movement. At 19 minutes and 12 seconds, Malik sent, "Copy complete. We're out. Clean." She closed her eyes for exactly 3 seconds. Then she texted Seung-ho. "It's done. The ping will come to you in a few minutes. You know what to do." His reply was immediate. Understood. She sat back and looked at the ceiling. The vault was gone. Not destroyed, copied and removed, its contents now in the hands of her brother's team, its secrets converted from Tae-jun's leverage into hers. Combined with the financial architecture documentation in her notebook, combined with the corporate transfers already in progress, combined with what Seung-ho had given her access to, she now had something that had not existed a week ago. She had everything. Not the appearance of leverage. Not a partial dismantling. Everything. The complete structural genome of the most powerful criminal organization in South Korea, documented, legally transferred where possible, and now held by people who owed nothing to Kang Tae-jun and had every reason to ensure it was deployed with precision. She thought about him downstairs. He was home tonight. She had heard him come in at 9, heard the characteristic sounds of a man who was worried and was managing it through routine, the ice in the glass, the television in his study set low, the specific pattern of footsteps of someone pacing between their desk and their window. She had lived with those sounds for 12 years. She could read his emotional state through the floor the way a sailor reads weather through the quality of wind. He was scared, not panicked. Tae-jun did not do panic. His psychology was not configured for it, but scared in the deep structural way of a man who has built his entire identity on being impossible to threaten and is beginning, for the first time, to feel the specific cold of the possibility that he was wrong. She stood, went to the window. The city outside was doing what it always did, burning against the dark, indifferent to what happened inside the houses that looked out at it. She thought about what Seung-ho had told her about the boy in Busan, Kang-jun, 22 years old, who did not know his father's name. She thought about that for a moment with the particular quality of attention she gave to information that was not directly operational but that mattered in ways harder to categorize. There were things Tae-jun had done that were in a different register from the financial crimes, from the power manipulation, from even what he had done to her publicly. There were things that sat lower. In the part of her that existed before strategy and before the trained composure and before everything her education and her upbringing had built her into. She had known, in the abstract, that he was capable of this. She had chosen not to look at it directly for a very long time. She was looking at it now. She did not include what Seung-ho had told her about June in any of the documentation. That was not her information to weaponize. That boy's existence was not a piece on a board. She had made that decision before Seung-ho had finished his sentence, and she felt the solidity of it in a way that had nothing to do with strategy and everything to do with being the daughter of a woman who had known the difference between justice and cruelty and had taught her daughter to know it too. Saturday morning, Tae-jun came into the kitchen while she was making coffee. He looked like a man who had been awake until 3. He had the hollow-eyed, jaw-tight look of someone who has been in their own head for hours and has not found what they were looking for. He sat down at the kitchen island. She set a cup of coffee in front of him without being asked. He wrapped both hands around it, looked at it for a moment, Seung-ho isn't answering his phone, he said. She was still facing the counter. Her back was to him. She kept her hand steady on the edge of the counter for 1 beat, 2, then turned around with the unhurried movement of someone whose coffee was still brewing and who had just heard a piece of mundane information. He was traveling this week, wasn't he? Something about the Busan office rotation. She said it evenly, reached for her own cup. Taejun looked at her. Something in his eyes had shifted. Not suspicion yet, not the directed, focused suspicion of a man with a theory, but the diffuse, uncomfortable instinct of a man whose world is beginning to feel subtly wrong in ways he can't yet map. Like a building that has settled slightly off its foundation. Nothing has collapsed, nothing is visibly broken, but something in the angle of the light through the windows is different from yesterday. I've had him on the same phone for 15 years, Taejun said. He picks up. Call his assistant, she said. Maybe his phone died. He looked at her for another moment. She met his eyes with the complete, unwavering steadiness she had been practicing her entire adult life. The stillness that was not emptiness but control. The face that revealed exactly what she chose to reveal and nothing else. He looked away first, drank his coffee. She turned back to the counter and breathed through her nose, slow and even, and felt the razor edge of the moment she was standing on. Because Taejun was smart, had always been smart, and the distance between his current diffuse unease and a fully formed, correctly directed suspicion was not as great as she needed it to be, and the sequence was not yet complete, and there were still 4 to 5 days of operational work before everything was in position, and she needed those days. And every hour between now and then required her to be exactly what she had always been to him. Present, composed, unremarkable. The woman he had decided was furniture. His phone rang. He looked at the screen. Something changed in his face. A hardening, a focusing. The shift from general anxiety to specific alarm. He answered without speaking and listened for 12 seconds, and then said, in a voice that was very quiet and very controlled, "Send me everything you have right now," and ended the call. He sat very still. She watched his back, watched the way his shoulders had changed. No longer the loose tension of a worried man, but something more locked, more deliberate. The posture of a man whose brain has just received a signal that overrides everything else and is now running on a different frequency entirely. "Taejun," she said, her voice completely steady. He turned around slowly. And she saw it. The beginning of it, not fully formed yet, not aimed at her yet, but moving in her direction with the terrible, slow inevitability of something that had been set in motion a week ago in a ballroom where he had raised a glass and kissed a woman and believed there were no consequences for men like him. "The vault," he said. His voice was almost toneless. "Someone accessed the vault last night." The kitchen was very quiet. She held his gaze with everything she had. Every year of training, every discipline she had ever built, every lesson her mother had left her. "What vault?" she said. And he looked at her, and she watched the question form behind his eyes, the question he was not yet ready to ask out loud because asking it out loud would mean admitting something about the shape of his world that he was not, in this moment, prepared to survive. "What vault?" she said. The words came out clean, completely clean. Not a millisecond of hesitation, not a fractional shift in register, not a single physiological tell that she could feel in herself. No heat at the throat, no tightening behind the eyes, nothing. 12 years of practice had built something in her that functioned like a second skeleton, and it was holding her upright now in this kitchen in the gray Saturday morning light, while her husband looked at her with eyes that were doing something she had not seen them do before. Not anger. Not yet. Something more dangerous than anger. The specific focused stillness of a man whose intelligence has just received a piece of information that doesn't fit his existing model of the world, and who is now, with the cold, systematic precision that had made him the most powerful criminal figure in South Korea for 2 decades, beginning to rebuild that model from the ground up. He looked at her for 7 seconds. She counted them without moving. Then he picked up his phone from the counter, looked at the screen once, and walked out of the kitchen. She stood still until she heard his study door close. Then she turned back to the counter and pressed both palms flat against the cold stone surface and breathed. 1 breath, 2, deliberate and slow. The kind of breathing that was not calming down but maintaining altitude. The difference between a pilot leveling a plane and a pilot panicking at the controls. He didn't have enough yet. She knew that. What his team had found was the access event. The vault had been entered, its contents copied. They had the timestamp. They had the evidence of the breach. What they did not yet have was the identity of who had done it, because Malik's team had come in through a routing architecture that would take significantly longer than a Saturday morning to untangle, if it could be untangled at all. She had days. Maybe. She needed to move. She went upstairs, closed the bedroom door, called Malik. He picked up on the first ring, which meant he already knew. He found out about the vault, she said. I know. One of his security people pulled the server logs faster than we anticipated. They don't have the routing yet, but they're running it. How long do we have before they trace it back? Realistically, 48 to 72 hours before they get close enough to be dangerous. A pause. We need to accelerate the third transfer, the Hong Kong bridge structure. If that completes before he has a target, it becomes legally irreversible, and it doesn't matter what he suspects. Do it. Today. It's Saturday. Malik. The word came out harder than she intended. She softened it slightly, not for his comfort, but because the hard edge meant something was fraying and she couldn't afford that right now. Whatever it costs to move the Hong Kong transfer today, pay it. Get it done. All right. She could hear him already moving, the sounds of someone shifting from assessment to action. There's something else. He paused in a way that had a specific quality, not hesitation, but the particular care of someone about to deliver information they know will land wrong. Lee Byung-ki has been in contact with Tae-jun's legal team. She went still. Lee Byung-ki was the regulatory compliance specialist on Malik's team, the man from Hong Kong, the man who had been in the room for every structural conversation about the transfer framework, the man who had access to the timeline, the sequencing, and the legal architecture she had spent 4 years building. Since when? She said. We don't know exactly. We flagged a communication anomaly this morning, encrypted outgoing traffic from his work device that doesn't match any of our project protocols. The pattern suggests it's been happening for at least 5 days. 5 days. The Hong Kong bridge structure briefing had been 6 days ago. He had walked out of that meeting knowing everything about the second transfer corridor, knowing the timeline, knowing the ownership chain that connected the Cayman holding structure back to her father's network. The cold she felt was not panic. It was something more precise than panic. The specific sensation of understanding that the architecture you have spent years building has a crack in it that you did not put there, and that the crack is structural, and that you are going to have to work with a cracked structure or you are not going to be able to work at all. Pull him from the team, she said. Right now, change every access credential he's touched and find out exactly what he sent. Already pulling him. The credentials are being rotated. A pause. Yeah, if he's already given Tae-jun the ownership chain, then we're running on a different clock than I thought we were. She sat on the edge of the bed. The room was very quiet. Find out what he sent. Everything else continues. She ended the call. Sat for a moment in the bedroom that still smelled like 12 years of shared life. The particular combination of his cologne and the wood polish she'd always insisted on for the furniture, and something indefinable that was just the accumulated atmosphere of a place where two people had lived long enough to leave an invisible residue of themselves on every surface. She had planned for many contingencies. She had not planned specifically for a traitor inside her brother's team, because she had trusted Malik's vetting, and Malik's vetting had been, until 5 days ago, entirely sound. She understood that this was not a failure of intelligence, but a vulnerability inherent to any operation that required human beings. Human beings with debts, with pressures, with the particular susceptibility of anyone who is offered enough money by someone sufficiently terrifying. What she had not yet fully calculated was what Lee Byung-ki had actually sent. If it was only the ownership chain, the corporate architecture connecting the transfers back to her father's network, that was containable. Legally complex to weaponize, easily rerouted, and not individually sufficient to tell Tae-jun what he most needed to know. If it was the timeline and the sequencing, that was worse. That told him not just what was happening, but how it was designed to happen, which was the difference between a man who knows he's been robbed and a man who understands exactly how the robbery was engineered. If it was the source documentation, the forensic financial records she had provided to Malik's team, The records that could only have come from someone with 12 years of intimate access to the Hanseong Syndicate's internal operations. Then he already knew it was her. She heard, from downstairs, the sound of Taejun's study door opening. His footsteps on the stairs were different from his usual footsteps. Not louder. If anything, slightly slower, more deliberate, the paced tread of a man who is moving towards something he has decided to face and is not in a hurry about it because hurrying would imply something he refuses to perform. She stood up, straightened, turned toward the door. He opened it without knocking, which he had not done in years. He was still holding his phone. His face had completed whatever transition it had been in the middle of downstairs. The diffuse unease was gone, and what had replaced it was the face she had seen him turn on other people over the years and had never seen turned on her. Not cold, exactly. More absolute than cold. The face of a man who has made a decision about someone. He set his phone on the dresser, screen up. She could see from where she stood that there was a document open on it. A photograph of a document, several pages, the text too small to read from this distance, but the formatting immediately recognizable to her as the kind of corporate structure diagram that lived inside the notebook in her study downstairs. "Sit down," he said. "I'm fine standing." A pause. He looked at her with those new eyes, not her husband's eyes, the eyes of the man who had kissed her on their second date in a restaurant in Singapore and told her she was the most interesting person he had ever met. The other eyes, the ones he used when he was conducting a reckoning. "Lee Byung-ki," he said. She said nothing. "You know that name." "Tell me what you think you know, Taejun." Something moved through his face. Brief, quickly controlled, but real. Not anger. She would have preferred anger. This was the expression of a man absorbing something that hurts him, which was a more dangerous state for her to be in a room with than a man who was simply furious. Because fury could be managed and hurt in a man like Taejun, converted very quickly into something it was much harder to navigate around. "The Cayman holding structure," he said. "It's your father's." She held his gaze. "Chung Bae-soo's fund. The Hong Kong bridge entity. Both of them trace back to a holding network registered to an investment architecture that has Chief Solomon Adeyemi's fingerprints on it going back 8 years. He picked up the phone, walked toward her until he was close enough that she could see the fine detail of his face, the exhaustion beneath the control, the shadow around his eyes that was 3 days of almost no sleep, the jaw that had been clenched for so long it had left a visible tightness all the way up to his temples. He held the phone so she could see the screen. "This is what Lee Byung-ki sent me." She looked at the screen, looked at what was there, the ownership chain, the timeline, the sequencing. And at the bottom of the last page, in her own handwriting, a single page photographed from her notebook, one of the corporate structure diagrams she had drawn 4 years ago in the quiet of her study after putting it together for the first time. Her handwriting, her diagram, her notebook. She understood in that moment, with the absolute clarity of someone whose remaining operational timeline had just been compressed from days to hours, that Lee Byung-ki had not simply sold information about the transfer structure. He had found the source. Somehow, she didn't yet know how, would work that out later. He had obtained a photograph of her private documentation and included it in what he sent. Taejun was watching her face. She knew he was watching her face. She kept it still. "Taejun, how long?" His voice was very quiet, almost gentle, which was worse than shouting. She made a decision in the space of a breath. Not the decision she had planned for this moment. She had not planned for this moment. Had planned for a version of this conversation that happened much later, on her terms, when everything was already complete and irreversible. This was not that conversation. This was a conversation she was having without the protection of a finished operation, with several critical transfers still pending, with a man who now had enough information to be genuinely dangerous to her and to Malik and potentially to her father. She needed him off balance, not with denials he wouldn't believe. With truth, a specific, carefully deployed truth that would hit him in the place he was least defended. "Since the day you stopped treating me like a person," she said. The room went very still. He looked at her. Something in his face fractured, not visibly, not in any way that would have been legible to anyone who didn't know him the way she did. But she knew him. 12 years of knowing someone who did not let people know him was still 12 years. "You are going to take everything," he said. I was going to take back what was used without credit and discarded without consideration. She kept her voice even. Not cold, even. The difference mattered. Cold would read as a performance. Even was just true. Not everything. I was never going to destroy you, Taejun. I was going to make sure that when I left with something that couldn't be reversed, that you couldn't come after me and take back. That's a very clean way to describe dismantling a 20-year empire. The empire was built with my work too. The words landed. She saw them land, watched him do what she had watched him do with difficult truths his entire life, not deny them. Taejun was too intelligent to deny things he knew were accurate, but absorbed them in a way that reclassified them as a different kind of truth than the one she intended. A truth that was real but manageable, a truth that could be worked around. The transfers that have already completed, he said. Baesu's fund, the first corridor. Legally finalized, irreversible, he set his jaw. I can litigate. Through which courts, Taejun? She kept her voice level. With which documentation? Everything that completed was a clean legal transaction. There is no mechanism through which you can reverse a fully executed international corporate transfer without triggering the kind of legal scrutiny that will unravel far more than you want unraveled. A pause. You know that. You know corporate law better than most attorneys. He turned away, moved to the window, stood with his back to her looking out at the garden, the ginkgo tree visible from up here, still holding a few gold leaves against the gray sky. She watched the line of his back, the set of his shoulders, the specific posture of a man who is doing something he almost never allowed himself to do in front of another person. He was thinking at the edge of what he knew. The vault, he said, without turning around. Yes. You have everything in it. Yes. A long silence. She could hear him breathing from across the room, slightly heavier than normal. The breath of sustained physical stress that the body produces regardless of what the mind is doing to contain it. You're not going to use it to go to law enforcement, he said. That would expose your father's network to the same investigation. No, she said. I'm not. Then what? Insurance, she said. The same thing you used it for. The guarantee that you don't come after me, don't come after my family, don't attempt to reverse what's been done. The same guarantee of untouchability that you gave yourself extended to me. A pause. That's all I ever wanted, Taejun. A clean exit that couldn't be undone. He was quiet for a long time. She stood and waited and did not fill the silence, because filling it would have been a form of anxiety, and she could not afford anxiety right now, could not afford anything that compromised the impression that she was still in full control of this situation. She was not entirely in full control of this situation. The third transfer, the Hong Kong Bridge, was still pending. The vault contents were in her brother's hands, but the full deployment architecture, the structures that would make the insurance function the way she'd described to Taejun just now, was not yet complete. She needed another 24 to 36 hours. She needed him to absorb what he knew and not do anything irreversible in the next day and a half. She needed to manage him through the next 36 hours. He turned from the window. His face had rearranged itself again. Not the reckoning face, not the hurt face. Something harder to read. Something that sat between the two and was its own thing. Park Seong-ho, he said. Her stomach tightened. She kept it off her face. Seong-ho didn't respond to the vault security ping, Taejun said. He was watching her with the absolute precision of a man running an interrogation. He had run hundreds of times on people less composed than she was, but had never run on someone who knew him well enough to know exactly how he ran it. He's the only one of my 3 trusted contacts who didn't respond. You know what that means to me. I imagine it means you're going to try to reach him. I already tried. He's not at his apartment. His car is gone. His phone is off. He took one step toward her. Not threatening. Or not only threatening. There was something else in the step, something that had the quality of a man crossing a distance he had never expected to be necessary. Who else, Naya? She said nothing. Who else knew? Who else did you bring inside my house? His voice had gone low in a way that was more frightening than volume, the quiet of a man who has organized his fury into something operational. Because Seong-ho didn't get the vault location from the financial documentation. He had it because I told him, which means you worked him directly, which means you looked at the people in my life and you identified the one who was reachable and you reached him. He stopped close enough that she could see, with the clarity of proximity, how much this was costing him. Not the empire, not the money, not even the operational humiliation. This specific loss. Seung-ho has been with me since the beginning. Seung-ho made his own choice, she said. You helped him make it. I gave him the opportunity to make a different one than he'd been making for 19 years. She held her ground, didn't step back. That was his to take or leave. Taejun looked at her for a long moment. Then quietly, with no performance in it, he said, I didn't know you were capable of this. She felt that land. Felt it land in the specific part of her that was still, despite everything, the woman who had loved this man, and she did not let what she felt do anything visible. But she felt it. That, she said, is exactly why we're standing here. He turned away. She thought he was going back to the window. Instead, he picked up his phone from the dresser and dialed a number and said, when it was answered, 3 words she could hear clearly in the quiet room. Find Park Seung-ho. The bottom dropped out of the moment, not because finding Seung-ho would unravel everything. Seung-ho was already gone, already out of the city. She had made sure of that through a chain of communication that didn't run through any channel Taejun could trace. But because what she was hearing in those 3 words was not the sound of a man negotiating. It was the sound of a man who had absorbed what he knew and had decided that the conversation they were having was not the actual field of engagement. He was still playing. She had given him truth, specific, targeted truth designed to land in the right places. And he had received it and processed it and was playing past it, which meant he was not as destabilized as she had needed him to be, which meant the 36 hours she needed were not 36 hours she was going to get, which meant the entire remaining sequence was now operating under a compression she had not built it to handle. Her phone buzzed in her pocket. She did not take it out. She felt it buzz a second time, which was Malik's code for urgent, and she stood in the bedroom with her husband on the phone 4 feet away and did not reach for her phone and did not change her expression. He finished the call, looked at her. I'm going to need you to stay in the house today, he said. Not a request. She looked at him with everything steady. Are you asking me or telling me? I'm telling you. He picked up his jacket from the back of the chair. We're not finished with this conversation. Where are you going? He paused at the door, looked back at her with the new eyes, the ones she still did not have a complete name for. To find out how much of my world is still standing. He left. She listened to his footsteps on the stairs, the front door, his car, on the drive. She took her phone out of her pocket. Malik's messages, 2 of them, sent 90 seconds apart. First, Lee Byung-ki didn't act alone. He had a handler. The handler works for Min Jae-won. She stared at that for a moment. Min Jae-won was not a name in her notebook. Min Jae-won was a name she knew from a different context entirely. A name Taejun had mentioned twice, years ago, in conversations she had filed away without understanding their full weight. Min Jae-won was the head of a rival syndicate based in Busan, a man who had been circling the edges of the Hanseong syndicate's territory for 3 years, who had the motive and the infrastructure to want Taejun weakened, and the intelligence to understand that the most efficient way to weaken him was not through violence, but through the kind of legal and financial dismantling that required someone on the inside. Someone like Lee Byung-ki, who had been placed on Malik's team, which meant Lee Byung-ki had not simply been turned by Taejun's people. He had been placed there by a third party who had known in advance that Malik's team was being assembled, who had known what Naya was doing, who had used the momentum of her operation to run a parallel one, letting her dismantle Taejun's financial structure while positioning Min Jae-won to move into the vacuum. She was not just dismantling Taejun's empire. She had been, without knowing it, clearing the ground for someone else to take it. The second message from Malik, Min Jae-won's people made a move on 2 of the transferred assets this morning. They're claiming a prior ownership interest through a shell entity we didn't see. Nya. They have documentation that predates ours. She sat down on the edge of the bed. The room was very quiet. The assets she had transferred, the ones she had intended as leverage, as the foundation of her exit, as the irreversible proof that she had taken back what was hers, were being contested by a third party she had not known existed in this picture. who had been watching her operation from the inside through Lee Byung-ki and had timed their claim with precision. She had spent 4 years building a blueprint. She had executed it with extraordinary care. She had navigated her husband, managed her brother's team, worked Seung-ho, protected herself on every front she could see. She had not seen Min Jae-won. She pressed her hand flat against the center of her chest, the private gesture, the one nobody else ever saw, and felt her own heartbeat. Not steady this time. Faster. The particular rhythm of a body that has absorbed a shock and is recalibrating. She sat with it for 10 seconds, allowed herself exactly 10 seconds of the feeling, the specific quality of having built something carefully and watched it crack, not because of your errors, but because of what you couldn't see. The grief and fury of that, the desire to break something with your hands. 10 seconds. Then she picked up the phone and called her father. He answered on the second ring. Min Jae-won, she said. A pause. Longer than his pauses usually were. That pause told her more than anything he was about to say. It told her that the name was not entirely unknown to him, which meant there was something her father knew that she had not been told, and the understanding of that arrived in her chest with a force she was not fully prepared for. How much do you know? He said. Tell me what I don't know, she said. Right now. All of it. Another pause. And then Chief Solomon Adeyemi, 71 years old, the most strategically careful man she had ever known, began to speak. And what he said changed the shape of everything she thought she had understood about. Chief Solomon Adeyemi spoke for 4 minutes and 11 seconds. Nia knew the duration because she watched the call timer on her phone screen while he talked. Not from anxiety, but from the particular discipline of a mind that anchors itself to measurable things when the ground beneath it is shifting. 4 minutes and 11 seconds. She did not interrupt him once. She sat on the edge of the bed in the room that still smelled like her marriage, and she listened to her father's voice coming through the phone from Lagos, and she felt the shape of everything she thought she had understood reorganize itself into something she did not entirely recognize. 3 years ago, Chief Solomon Adeyemi had been approached by Min Jae-won's financial representatives through a chain of intermediaries so carefully constructed that her father had not immediately identified the ultimate source. The approach had been framed as a legitimate joint investment opportunity. Infrastructure assets in Southeast Asia, the kind of diversified regional play that made complete strategic sense for a man of her father's portfolio. He had done preliminary due diligence. He had found nothing alarming. He had entered into a limited exploratory arrangement. It was only 8 months ago when Naya had sent her father the initial signal, the first communication that told him she was preparing to move, that he had begun a more comprehensive investigation into the arrangement and discovered that the Southeast Asian infrastructure entity had a secondary ownership layer that traced back through 7 corporate shells to Min Jae-won's Busan operation. By that point, the arrangement was not yet active, had never transferred any funds, existed only as a framework. Her father had terminated it immediately. He had not told Naya because he had assessed, incorrectly, she understood now, that the termination had been clean enough that Min Jae-won's connection to their operation was severed. What he had not accounted for was that the 8 months of preliminary due diligence had given Min Jae-won's people enough exposure to the structural architecture of Chief Solomon Adeyemi's holding network to identify Lee Byung-ki as a vulnerable point of entry. They had not needed the arrangement to remain active. They had needed the window it provided, and they had used it. "I'm sorry," her father said. He said it without the hedges and qualifications that people used when they were apologizing for things they believed were defensible. He said it the way he said everything, directly, completely, with the understanding that the word meant what it meant, and that adding more words around it would only dilute it. She sat with it for a moment. "How much does Min Jae-won know about my documentation?" she said. Lee Byung-ki had access to the transfer architecture and the timeline. He had the photograph of your notebook page. He did not have the vault contents. That access happened after he was pulled from the team. A pause. But he knows enough to know that the forensic documentation you hold came from inside the syndicate. He knows it came from someone with 12 years of intimate access. So he knows it was me. Yes. She stood up, moved to the window, the garden below, the ginkgo tree, the stone paths, the east wall where she had sat with Seung-ho in the cold. Min Jae-won's claim on the transferred assets, The documentation he filed this morning has a prior ownership shell that was created 14 months ago, before your transfers initiated. It was created specifically to manufacture a competing claim in anticipation of this moment. Her father's voice was steady, but she could hear something underneath it. Not guilt exactly, something more complex, the sound of a man who has made an error and is holding the full weight of it without trying to put any of it down. He's been watching your operation since almost the beginning. He let it run because it was doing his work for him. Weakening Taejun's structure, legally transferring assets out of the syndicate's control. His plan was always to step in at the moment of maximum disruption and claim the vacuum. Team up. She pressed her forehead briefly against the cold glass of the window. Outside, the gray October sky sat low and indifferent over everything. The vault contents, she said. Do we still have clean control? Yes. Min Jae-won doesn't have access to the vault. That remains entirely yours. Then that's what we use. She pulled back from the window. Her reflection ghosted briefly in the glass. A woman in a robe, phone to her ear, standing in a room that was ending. She didn't look at the reflection long. I need you to do something, she said to her father. Right now, today. Not through Malik's team, directly through your main legal infrastructure. I need you to initiate a full formal claim on every asset in the transfer chain using the original documentation, not the transfer records, the source documentation. The 4 years of records that establish the intellectual and strategic contribution to the syndicate's financial architecture. She was moving as she spoke across the room, to the drawer where her encrypted drive sat. We're going to make the case that the assets being contested were never solely Taejun's to control, because a significant portion of their value was generated by work that was never compensated and never credited. That's a viable legal framework in 3 of the 4 jurisdictions where the transfers completed. Silence on the line. Then, that exposes your role inside the syndicate's operations. Selectively, I control what gets disclosed and what doesn't. The vault gives me the leverage to control that. She picked up the drive, held it in her hand. Min Jae-won is counting on me being too afraid of exposure to fight the claim publicly. He's wrong. Another pause. Longer. You're sure? I'm sure. She wasn't entirely sure, but she was sure enough. And the difference between entirely sure and sure enough was the difference between people who acted and people who were still calculating when the window closed. Father, make the call. I'll make it within the hour, he said. She ended the call, stood in the middle of the bedroom with the drive in her hand and the full weight of the operational situation pressing down on every surface she had. Min Jae-won, a third player she hadn't seen. Assets under competing claim. A husband who had just left the house to assess his damage. A team that had been compromised from the inside. 36 hours of timeline compressed to something she didn't yet have a number for. She took one breath, held it, released it. Then she got dressed, and she went to work. She called Malik from the car. She was not going to stay in the house, whatever Taejun had told her, because the house was no longer a safe operational environment, and compliance with his instruction was not something she owed him anymore. The vault, she said. I need a specific file from it. Everything we have on Min Jae-won's Busan operation. Any transactions, any leverage material, any documentation of illegal activity that falls under international financial crime statutes. She could hear Malik pulling it, keys, movement. There's a substantial file. Taejun had been building it for 2 years. Min Jae-won was on his radar as a competitive threat. There are transaction records, communication intercepts, a document that appears to be a record of a bribery arrangement with 3 senior officials in the Busan municipal government. Send it to father's legal team, encrypted, right now. Done. A pause. Yeah, Taejun is moving. His legal team filed an injunction 40 minutes ago against Bae-su's transfer entity. They're claiming the transfer was executed under fraudulent misrepresentation. On what basis? They're alleging that the acquiring entity misrepresented its ownership structure to Bae-su at the time of signing. He paused. It's thin, but it doesn't need to hold. It just needs to create enough legal uncertainty to freeze the asset while they build a bigger case. Which judge? Park Hyun-soo, Gangnam District. She knew that name. She knew it from her notebook. Park Hyun-soo appeared in the bribery documentation she had assembled 4 years ago, a judicial official who had received 2 payments from a syndicate-connected corporate entity in exchange for favorable rulings in 3 separate commercial cases. She had the transaction records. She had the dates. She had the account numbers. "Can you get me to the courthouse this afternoon?" she said. A pause. "You're going to walk into a courthouse where your husband just filed an injunction and I'm not walking in as Nia Adeyemi, the chairman's wife." She looked out the car window, the city sliding past. "I'm walking in as the forensic financial analyst who has documented evidence of judicial corruption relevant to an active case. I'm walking into the clerk's office and I'm filing an emergency counter-submission under the International Financial Crimes Disclosure Framework. That's a public filing. It goes on the record. And once it's on the record, Park Hyun-soo cannot touch this case without every move he makes being scrutinized in the context of what I've just disclosed." Malik was quiet for a moment. She heard him absorbing it, the audacity of it, the exposure it required, the way it converted 12 years of careful concealment into a public instrument. "That's burning your cover," he said quietly. "My cover burned this morning when Taijun read my handwriting off his phone screen." She said it evenly, without bitterness, because bitterness was not a productive frequency to operate on. "The concealment phase is over. We're in the open now." She heard him exhale. "I'll have the documentation formatted for the clerk's office in 40 minutes. 20, she said. "I'm already in the car." The courthouse filing took 11 minutes. She stood at the clerk's counter in a gray coat, her hair down for the first time in days. And she submitted the documentation with the composed professionalism of a woman who had spent 2 years working in London's financial investigative sector and understood exactly what she was filing and exactly what it meant. The clerk processed it without looking up. The timestamp went on the record at 2:17 in the afternoon. She walked out of the courthouse into the cold October air and stood on the steps for a moment and felt, not relief, not triumph, something more functional than either, the specific sensation of having made an irreversible move that could not be taken back and was either going to work or wasn't, and understanding that the uncertainty of that was something she was going to have to carry forward rather than resolve by standing still. Her phone rang. She looked at the screen. Not Malik. Not her father. Taejun. She answered. "Where are you?" Not a question. The particular flat statement of a man who already knows the answer and is asking to establish that he knows. "I told you I wasn't staying in the house," she said. "You just filed a judicial corruption disclosure in the Gangnam District Clerk's office." His voice was very controlled. Beneath the control, she could hear something she had not heard in him before. Not anger, not hurt. The specific tone of a man who is operating at a sustained extreme and is beginning to feel the physical cost of it. The exhaustion of someone who has been running on alertness and adrenaline for 72 hours and is starting to hit the edge of what that can sustain. "Yes," she said. "That documentation, Park Hyun-soo. You had that for how long?" 4 years. She heard him breathing. "You've been building this for 4 years. I told you when it started." Another silence. "Come back to the house." And then, in a different register, stripped of the controlled authority, something rawer underneath it. "Nya, come back to the house. We need to talk about Min Jae-won." She went still on the courthouse steps. The city moved around her, people, traffic, the indifferent machinery of Seoul conducting its ordinary afternoon. "What do you know about Min Jae-won?" she said. "More than you do." A pause. "And less than I should, which is why I need you here." Another pause. A longer one. "He's not after the assets, he's after the vault. He knows I lost access to it. He knows someone has it. He's been running his own operation to locate it for the last 48 hours. Her hand tightened slightly on the phone. "He won't find it. He has people I don't know about. He had someone inside your brother's team. He may have someone else somewhere I haven't located yet." She heard him move. Footsteps. A door. "He's not going to stop at the legal claim. The legal claim is a distraction. Something to keep your attention on the courts while he moves on a different front." She stood on the steps and she thought about this for 2 seconds. Not long, because 2 seconds was what she had. and she understood that what Taejun was telling her was either true or it was the most precise manipulation he had ever attempted, using her own threat as leverage to pull her back into proximity. She could not fully distinguish between those possibilities from here. She could not fully distinguish between them at all, because she was operating under conditions she had not designed for, with information she had received 11 minutes ago about a player she had not known existed 48 hours earlier. She thought about Min Jae-won. She thought about what it meant that he had been patient enough to let her operation run for months, using it as cover, waiting for the moment of maximum disruption. That was not the behavior of someone who was only after assets. Assets could be acquired through cleaner means. That level of patience, that particular kind of strategic restraint, it was the behavior of someone who wanted something more specific. The vault, not for the leverage it provided in soul, for what it contained about Min Jae-won himself. 2 years of documentation that Taejun had assembled on him. Transaction records, bribery files, the kind of material that could end a criminal operation not through violence but through the very legal and financial mechanisms that Taejun had always been too embedded to be vulnerable to. Min Jae-won knew the vault existed. He knew it had been accessed and removed. He did not know who had it. But he knew that whoever had it held the complete record of everything he had done for 2 years in a format that could be delivered to international financial crime authorities and that no amount of corporate structuring could protect him from. He was not going to stop at filing a competing ownership claim. "I'll come to the house," she said. She ended the call, stood for one more second on the steps. Then she called Malik. "Move the vault contents to the secondary server, right now, before I get back to the house. Change the access credentials and send the new ones only to Father. Not to me, not stored on any device I'm carrying. Father holds the access until I tell him otherwise." "Why are you—" "Because if Min Jae-won's people move on me directly, I can't give them what I don't have access to." She was already walking toward the car. "And I need to make sure Taejun understands that too." She got into the car. Mr. Beck looked at her in the mirror with the expression of a man who had been driving her for 6 years and had understood for approximately 5 of them that he was employed by a woman considerably more complex than the role she occupied. "Home," she said. He drove. Seoul moved past the windows. She sat in the back and she breathed and she did not look at her phone and she thought about what the next 2 hours required of her. Returning to a house where her husband was waiting, where he had information she needed and she had information he needed, where they were going to have to find a way to be temporarily useful to each other against a common threat while simultaneously being each other's primary adversaries. The specific geometry of that. She had not built this operation to collaborate with Kang Taejun. She had built it to exit him. But Min Jae-won had restructured the situation in a way that made her exit, for the next several hours, dependent on the man she was exiting. That was a bitterness, she noted and set aside. Bitterness was not a productive frequency. Taejun was in the study when she arrived, standing behind his desk, not sitting. The desk had 3 laptops open on it and 2 phones and a legal pad covered in handwriting. Not his usual annotations, more compressed, more urgent. The handwriting of a man working at the edge of what he could manage. His jacket was gone. His shirt was rolled to the elbows. He had not eaten anything today. She could tell from the specific quality of his alertness, bright and slightly brittle, the alertness of caffeine and cortisol without the grounding of food, the kind of state that produced sharp thinking and poor judgment in roughly equal measure. He looked up when she came in. Something moved through his face that she didn't have a name for and didn't try to name. "Sit down," he said. "Tell me what you know about Min Jae-won first." He held her gaze for a moment. Then he turned one of the laptops to face her. On the screen was a communication record, intercepted clearly through whatever surveillance apparatus the syndicate maintained, dated 2 days ago. She scanned it. It was a communication between 2 of Min Jae-won's operational people, discussing the location of a holding facility. Not for assets, for a person. She looked up from the screen. "Park Seong-ho," Taejun said. His voice was flat. Min Jae-won's people found him this morning. He was moving through Incheon toward the ferry terminal. A pause. "They have him." The room went very quiet. She looked at the communication record again, the timestamp, the location reference, the specific language used, not the language of a financial transaction, but the language of people who were holding someone against their will and wanted their colleagues to know they had leverage. Seung-ho, who had walked away from 19 years because he had decided that protecting a child in Busan from being used as a piece was worth the cost of everything else, who had given her the vault location and paid for it by becoming a man without a side, who was now in the hands of someone who had no interest in what Seung-ho knew and every interest in using him to reach what Seung-ho had helped create. She felt something that was not strategy and not calculation and not the disciplined management of emotion. She felt something that sat in her chest like a stone and was simply the weight of a person's life being used as currency because she had pulled him into this. "How long has he been held?" she said. "Since this morning. 6, 7 hours. Taejun was watching her. "They'll move him within the next few hours. Once he's moved to a secondary location, tracking him becomes significantly harder." "What do they want for him?" "The vault." He said it without inflection. "They don't know who has it, but they know Seung-ho knows who does." She looked at him. He looked at her. The study was very quiet, and outside the window the gray October afternoon was darkening toward evening, and the ginkgo tree in the garden had lost its last gold leaves. "They're going to hurt him until he tells them," she said. "Yes." A pause. "Unless we move first." She looked at the laptop screen again. The location reference in the communication. She had no field team. She had a forensic financial analyst and her brother and a set of lawyers in multiple countries and a father in Lagos and an encrypted drive she had just instructed herself to lose access to. She had a green notebook in a drawer and 12 years of documentation. She did not have the resources to extract a person from a holding location. Taejun did. She looked up at him. He held her gaze with the particular directness of a man who understood exactly what he was offering and what he was asking for in return, and was not going to dress it as anything other than what it was. "What do you want?" she said. "The vault contents stay out of Min Jae-won's hands, permanently, whatever it takes." He paused. "And you come back to the table, not as my wife, as my equal, the way it should have been from the beginning." He said the last sentence in a different voice, quieter, stripped of the operational texture, something raw under it that she had not heard in years, and recognized immediately, because it was the voice of the man she had married before power had finished its work on him. "I know it's too late for what that means between us. I'm not asking for that. I'm asking you to help me take down Min Jae-won before he takes down both of us. And then you can walk out of this house and out of this city, and I will not come after you. I swear it on—" He stopped himself, looked at the desk. "I will not come after you. You have my word." She stood across the desk from him. 12 years of knowing him told her his word was real. 12 years of knowing him also told her that his word was real right now, in this moment, under these conditions, and that the distance between now and later was a variable she had to price accurately. She thought about Seung-ho. 6 hours in a room somewhere in this city, held by people who would not stop because of his age or his history, or the particular dignity of a man who had finally decided to stop protecting the wrong thing. She thought about the vault, the contents her father was holding, the complete operational record of Min Jae-won's crimes, sitting in an encrypted server that Min Jae-won was willing to hold a 61-year-old man to reach. She thought about what it cost to say yes to this, what it meant operationally, what it meant personally, the specific grief of needing the man you were leaving in order to finish leaving him. She thought about all of it in approximately 4 seconds. "Where is he being held?" she said. Something in Taejun's face changed. Not relief. Something more complicated than relief. The expression of a man who has just been handed something he knows he doesn't deserve, and is holding it with the specific care of someone who understands its actual weight. He turned the second laptop to face her. On the screen was a map, a location marker on the eastern edge of the city, an industrial warehouse complex near the Jungnang district, the kind of place that existed in every large city as a space between spaces. Not quite commercial, not quite residential, the kind of geography that swallowed things without asking questions. She looked at the map, then at him. "How many of your people can you move in the next hour without triggering Min Jae-won's surveillance on your operation?" she said. He didn't hesitate. 6. Maybe 8 if I pull from the secondary rotation. 6 is enough. She straightened. "And Taejun?" She looked at him directly. "When this is over, when Seung-ho is out and Min Jae-won is finished, our agreement stands. Everything that transferred stays transferred. I walk. You don't follow. He held her gaze for a long moment. The study was very quiet. Outside, the city was beginning its evening transformation, lights coming on across the skyline, the gray afternoon surrendering to the particular darkness of a city that never fully went dark. Agreed, he said. She nodded, looked at the map again. Yungnong District. An hour, maybe less, before Min Jae-won's people moved Seong-ho to a secondary location and the window closed. She pulled out her phone, called Malik. I need father to do something, she said when he answered. Right now. I need him to transmit a single document from the vault, just one, the Busan Municipal Bribery Record, to the International Financial Crimes Monitoring Unit in Hong Kong. Not a full submission, a preliminary disclosure notification. Enough to put Min Jae-won's name on a monitoring list that he'll be able to confirm through his own channels within the hour. Malik understood immediately. She heard it in the quality of his silence, the recognition of what she was doing, the specific tactical elegance of it. You're going to make him pull back his people to manage the disclosure. I'm going to give him something more urgent than Seong-ho. She looked at Tae-jun across the desk. He can either keep holding an old man in a warehouse, or he can spend the next several hours managing an international financial crimes notification that has his name on it. He can't do both effectively. And while he's managing the disclosure, we get Seong-ho out. A pause. Yeah, if this doesn't make him pull back, if he decides the vault is worth the exposure, then we adjust. She said it with a steadiness she was not entirely feeling and was choosing anyway. Make the call, Malik. The room held its breath. Outside the window, Seoul burned against the coming dark, and somewhere on the eastern edge of the city, in a warehouse that asked no questions, a 61-year-old man was running out of. The disclosure notification hit Min Jae-won's monitoring channels at 7:43 in the evening. Malik confirmed it 11 minutes later with a single text. It landed. He knows. Nia was in the passenger seat of a black sedan she did not own, moving through the eastern edge of Seoul with Tae-jun driving and two of his security people following in a separate vehicle 3 blocks behind. She had not been in a car with Tae-jun driving in 4 years. He had stopped driving himself anywhere around the time he had stopped doing anything that didn't require an audience. And the specific strangeness of it registered briefly and then passed, because there was no room right now for the archaeology of small domestic details. She watched her phone, watched the screen the way she had watched the vault timer 2 weeks ago, with the focused stillness of someone waiting for a number to move. At 7:51, Malik texted. 2 of Min Jae-won's vehicles just left the Jungnang location, moving west. She exhaled through her nose. 2 vehicles just pulled out, she said. Tae-jun said nothing. His jaw was set. He was driving the way he did everything when he was in operational mode, though completely, without residual attention left over for anything else. She had forgotten this about him, the specific quality of his focus when the thing in front of him was the only thing that existed. How many are still inside? She said. Seong-ho would have had no more than 4 on him, Tae-jun said. If 2 vehicles left, that's 2 to 3 remaining, possibly less. She called Malik. Tell father to hold the full submission. Don't send anything else until I contact you. Understood. A pause. Yeah, be careful. She ended the call, looked at the map on her phone, 2 minutes out. The warehouse complex was exactly the kind of place she had expected from the map. A cluster of low industrial buildings off a secondary road. The kind of area that had been functional 20 years ago and was now the geography of in-between, half the units vacant, the signage faded, the kind of place where a vehicle could park for 12 hours without anyone asking why. Tae-jun pulled off the main road and cut the headlights. The follow vehicle did the same, stopping behind them. She looked at the complex through the windshield. 2 lights on in the 3rd building from the left. 1 vehicle parked at the side entrance, a dark van, plates she couldn't read from this distance. Tae-jun's phone buzzed. He looked at it. My people have a read on the interior layout. Single main space, 1 side room. The side room is where they're keeping him. She looked at the building, looked at the single vehicle, thought about the 2 that had left. Min Jae-won pulled most of his people to manage the disclosure. He left a skeleton crew because he still thought the warehouse location was secure. She paused. He didn't know you had the communication intercept. He still doesn't. Tae-jun looked at her. In the dark of the car, his face was stripped of everything except what was underneath. The tiredness, the operational focus, and something else she caught only briefly before he looked away. Something she wasn't going to name right now. Stay in the car. No. Nya. He's in there because of me, she said. Quietly. Not with heat, just true. I'm not staying in the car. He looked at her for a moment. The look of a man who wants to argue and knows the argument is already lost. Then he got out of the car. She got out and followed. What happened in the next 11 minutes was not elegant. It was not cinematic in the way of things that have been choreographed. It was loud in the wrong places and too fast in others. The specific ugly chaos of 3 of Taejun's security people moving through an industrial space in the dark, while 2 of Min Jae-won's remaining crew reacted with the desperate improvisation of people who had not been prepared for this. She heard shouting. She heard something heavy hit the concrete floor. She stood inside the main entrance with her back against the wall, and her phone in her hand and her heart hitting the inside of her sternum with a force that was entirely animal, the body's oldest response to proximity to danger, and she breathed through it and did not move from her position, because moving would have made her a variable in a situation that did not need more variables. It was over in 11 minutes. Taejun appeared in the doorway of the side room. His shirt had a tear at the shoulder. He looked at her and nodded once. She went in. Park Sung-ho was sitting on a metal chair in the center of the room. His hands had been zip-tied behind him, and someone had hit him at least twice, once across the left cheekbone, which was swelling and darkening, and once at the corner of his mouth, which had split and dried. He was breathing steadily. His eyes were open. When she walked in, he looked at her with an expression that moved through several registers in rapid succession. Relief, pain, something that might have been the specific emotion of a man who has been sitting alone in a dark room long enough to start making peace with outcomes, and is now having to unmake that peace, which is its own kind of disorienting. She knelt in front of him. "Are you hurt anywhere else?" "My pride," he said. His voice was rough. "Mostly my pride." She found the edge of the zip tie and looked up at one of Taejun's people who produced a blade and cut it. Seung-ho brought his arms forward slowly, the particular careful movement of someone whose shoulders had been held back for hours, and he pressed his hands against his knees and breathed. Taejun appeared in the doorway. He stood there and he looked at Seung-ho, and Seung-ho looked at him, and the room held 19 years in it for a moment. 19 years of proximity and loyalty, and the specific complicated history of 2 men who had built something together that neither of them was entirely proud of, and the silence between them was not hostile. It was just the silence of something that had reached its end and was acknowledging that fact without trying to make it into something cleaner than it was. "You should have told me," Taejun said. His voice was quiet. "You stopped listening," Seung-ho said. No anger in it, just fact. Taejun looked at the floor for a moment, then he looked up at one of his people. "Get him to a car." She stood, stepped back, watched them help Seung-ho to his feet. He stood without assistance, once upright, the dignity of a man who accepted help with the specific kind of acceptance that didn't concede anything, and watched him walk out of the side room and through the main space and out into the cold night. She was alone in the room, concrete floor, metal chair, a single bare light. She stood there for a moment looking at it, the particular stripped-down ugliness of a place that existed for a specific terrible purpose, and she felt the weight of the evening settle onto her in full, all of it. Seung-ho's face, the sound of something hitting the concrete floor, her own heartbeat against the warehouse wall, the fact that she had been standing in this room at all, in this building, in this part of the city that had nothing to do with the life she had come here to build 12 years ago. The distance between the woman she had been at 29, boarding a flight to Seoul with the specific excitement of someone whose life was about to begin in earnest, and the woman standing in a warehouse in the dark, thinking about what it had cost to finish what that life had become. She breathed, then she walked out. Min Jae-won was handled in the days that followed through mechanisms that made no noise. The preliminary disclosure notification her father had sent to the Hong Kong monitoring unit was followed, 48 hours later, by a comprehensive submission. The full Busan municipal bribery documentation, the transaction records, the communication intercepts, everything the vault contained on Min Jae-won's operation, delivered through 3 separate international legal channels simultaneously. The Busan operation began collapsing within a week, not through dramatic violence or public spectacle, But through the quiet, inexorable machinery of international financial crime investigation, asset freezes, the withdrawal of the corrupt officials who had propped the operation up the moment those officials understood that their names were in documentation being reviewed by people they could not reach. The competing ownership claim on the transferred assets was withdrawn 4 days after the submission. A legal letter citing procedural irregularities in the original filing. No explanation, no face-saving language, simply gone, the way things go when the person who filed them no longer has the infrastructure to defend them. Nia received the confirmation from her father's legal team on a Thursday morning. She was in the study when the email came in. The same study, the same desk, the same photograph of her mother at the corner. She read the email, set the laptop down, sat for a moment in the quiet of the room. It was over. Not cleanly, there were still legal complexities, still documentation to process, still the ongoing management of what had been transferred and what it would become. But the operational phase was finished. The thing she had built and nearly lost and rebuilt under conditions she had not designed for was complete. Every transfer stood. The vault contents were held in a structure that protected her and her family with the same comprehensive certainty that Tae-jun had once used to protect himself. Min Jae-won was finished. Seung-ho was safe. He had left Seoul 3 days ago for a destination she knew and would not share. And she had spoken to him once by phone, briefly, a conversation that had not required many words because they had already said the essential things in a warehouse in the Yeongnam district. She sat in the study and she let herself feel all of it, the whole weight of it, without managing it or compartmentalizing it or converting it into something useful. She let it be what it was, the grief of it, the cost of it, the particular exhaustion of someone who has spent 4 years carrying something enormous in complete concealment and has finally set it down. She let herself feel the loss of the marriage. Not the marriage it had become, but the marriage it had been. The man who had been real in the beginning, the life she had believed she was building. She felt that loss the way you feel any real loss. Not cleanly, not with resolution, but with the ragged honesty of something that hurt, and was also, in some complicated way she did not entirely understand yet, necessary. She sat in the study for a long time. Then she went upstairs and started packing. She packed one suitcase, small, the kind of bag you packed when you were leaving a place rather than moving to a new one, when the destination was what mattered and the weight of what you were carrying was something you wanted to think about carefully. She packed 3 changes of clothes, her toiletries, the encrypted drive, her mother's photograph, wrapped in a soft cloth and placed in the center of the bag with the particular care she gave to things that were irreplaceable, the green notebook. She looked at it for a moment before she placed it in the bag. All that handwriting, all those years of precise observation, the thing that had made everything else possible. It was hers. It had always been hers. She put it in the bag and closed it. She left behind everything Tae-jun had given her. The jewelry, the designer clothes, the accumulated expensive evidence of a life lived at a particular altitude of wealth. She kept only the simple gold ring her father had placed on her finger the morning she had left Lagos for London at 17. Not a wedding ring, not a symbol of any union, just a ring her father had given her because she was leaving home, and he had wanted her to carry something of him on her hand. She had worn it every day since, on her right hand, and she wore it now. She carried the suitcase downstairs, set it near the front door. Tae-jun was in the garden. She had not seen him since the night at the warehouse 4 days ago. He had not come upstairs that night or any night since. She had heard the house operating around her in the particular way of a large house that has reconfigured itself around an absence. The sounds of his occupation of the lower floors, the study, the main sitting room, the house adjusting to the geometry of 2 people who had decided something and were living in the aftermath of that decision before it was formally complete. She stood at the garden door and looked at him. He was standing near the ginkgo tree, her tree, the one she had planted in their 2nd year, now bare for winter, its gray branches making a spare architecture against the pale morning sky. He had his hands in the pockets of a dark coat. He was looking at the tree with the expression of a man who has run out of things to calculate and is simply standing in the world as it is. She opened the door. The cold morning air came in. She walked out. He heard her and turned. He looked at her. He looked at the coat she was wearing, the good coat, the traveling coat, not the house coat. And then he looked at her face and he understood. and something in his expression settled into a kind of stillness she hadn't seen in him before. Not the controlled stillness of a man managing his projection, but the actual stillness of a man who has reached the end of something and is not fighting it anymore. She stopped a few feet from him. They stood near the ginkgo tree in the cold morning and looked at each other. "Sung-ho told me something once," Taejun said. His voice was even. Not performing evenness, actually even, the way things are when the performance has been set down for good. He told me that the most dangerous thing a powerful man can do is stop being curious about the people closest to him. That the moment you stop asking questions about someone is the moment they become a stranger who knows everything about you. He looked at the tree. I thought he was giving me strategic advice. I thought everything he said to me was strategic advice. She didn't say anything. Let it be what it was. I stopped being curious about you, he said. That's the whole of it. Not the business, not Sarah. I stopped wondering who you were, what you were thinking, what you needed. I reclassified you and I stopped wondering. He looked at her. That's what you were telling me in the garden 3 weeks ago, and I didn't hear it until the warehouse. Until I was driving across the city at night to get someone out of a building because the operation I spent 20 years building was being taken apart by the person I had stopped paying attention to. She held his gaze. Would it have mattered? She said. If you'd heard it 3 weeks ago? If you'd heard it 3 years ago? He was quiet for a moment. Honest quiet. Not the silence of a man preparing an answer, but the silence of a man sitting with the actual shape of a question he doesn't have a clean answer to. I don't know, he said. I think I was too far into who I'd become to find my way back. I think the man you married stopped being available to you before you started the notebook. A pause. I think you waited longer than anyone should have had to wait. She felt that land. Felt it in the specific way of a true thing said too late. The accuracy of it, and the grief of accuracy that comes without remedy. What will you do? She said. He looked at the tree. Rebuild what's left. Smaller. Different. A pause. Honestly, for the first time in a long time, I don't know. Which is... He stopped. Almost smiled. Not the smile she'd seen him use in rooms full of people, but something older than that. Something that belonged to the man from before. Which is a strange thing to feel at 52. Not knowing. It feels like something I should have felt more of. She nodded, looked at the tree for a moment. The boy in Busan, she said. He went still. Seung-ho told me, she said. I didn't use it. I won't. She looked at him. He's 22 years old. He deserves to know the truth about where he comes from, and he deserves to know it from you and not from a file somewhere. She paused. That's all I'll say about it. Taejun stood very still beside the ginkgo tree. She watched something move through his face that she had no name for, something that was not the face he showed the world, or even the face he had shown her in 12 years, but something underneath both, something that belonged to whatever he had been before power had finished its work on him. I know, he said quietly. I know. She let the silence hold for a moment, then she said, I'm going to take my bag and go to the airport. He looked at her. Lagos. Lagos, she said. He nodded once, the single nod of a man who has made a promise and is keeping it. The transfers, the agreement stands. The agreement stands, she said, on both sides. She looked at him for a moment longer. Her husband, the man she had loved, the man he had become, all of it present simultaneously in the way that people are when you have known them long enough to hold all their versions at once. She did not reach for him. He did not reach for her. That distance was honest, and they were both, finally, being honest. Take care of yourself, Taejun, she said. You too, he said. And then quietly, in the specific register of a man who means something without any architecture around it. Nya, I'm sorry. She held that for a moment, set it somewhere it could be what it was without being more than it was. I know you are, she said. She walked back through the garden, through the door, picked up her suitcase from the front hall. Mr. Baek was waiting outside with the car, because Mr. Baek had always understood things before he was told them and had arrived without being called. She got into the back seat. The door closed. The car moved down the private road, through the gate, onto the street. Seoul opened up around her. The full ordinary complexity of it, the morning traffic, the storefront sliding past, the Han River appearing briefly between buildings, and then disappearing again, the city conducting its permanent business of existing regardless of what happened inside the lives it contained. She looked out the window and she did not feel triumphant. She had expected, at some point in the planning of this, that there would be a moment that felt like triumph. A clean, clear moment of having won something. There was no such moment. What there was instead was something harder to name and more durable. The specific feeling of having survived something that required everything you had, and of having survived it without becoming someone you didn't recognize, and of being in a car moving toward an airport with a suitcase that contained almost nothing, which turned out to be exactly the right amount. Her phone buzzed. Her father. "Your brother is at the airport. He'll meet you at departures." She smiled. Set the phone down on the seat. At Incheon International Airport's main departures hall, Nya Adeyemi walked through the automatic doors into the bright, temperature-controlled air of a place built specifically for the moment of leaving. She had her suitcase and her coat and the ring on her right hand. She had the notebook and the drive and her mother's photograph wrapped in cloth inside the bag. She had everything she was taking, and she was not looking back at anything she was leaving. Malik was waiting at the check-in area. He saw her from 30 meters away and walked toward her with the long-legged, unhurried stride of a man who had their father's patience and their mother's eyes. And when he reached her, he looked at her face for a moment, the way her brother looked at her, with the specific attention of someone who had known her since she was too young to perform anything, who had always been able to see through every layer to whatever was actually there. And then he put his arms around her. She let herself be held for a moment. Just a moment. Her face against her brother's shoulder, her eyes closed, the noise of the departures hall around them, the world in full motion, and this small, still point inside it. Then she pulled back, straightened, looked at him. "Ready?" he said. "Yes," she said. They walked toward the check-in desk together. She set her suitcase on the scale, handed over her passport. The agent processed it with the professional efficiency of someone who handles 100 departures a day and has no way of knowing which ones contain anything worth noting. The boarding pass printed. The agent handed it across the counter. Lagos. Departure, 11:15. She took the boarding pass, put it in her coat pocket, turned to Malik. In the departures hall, moving toward security, she passed a woman standing near the information board. Young, early 20s, beautifully dressed in a way that looked slightly uncertain around the edges. The careful assembly of someone who was not yet fully comfortable with the room she was trying to occupy. She was holding a boarding pass and looking at the board with the expression of someone who was not entirely sure they were in the right place. Yoon Sera. Their eyes met. A full second. Maybe two. Neither of them said anything. There was nothing to say that wouldn't have required the wrong kind of simplicity. The simplification of a complicated thing into something that would fit inside an airport exchange between strangers who were not strangers. Yoon Sera looked at her with an expression that was not hostility and not apology, but something more honest than either. The expression of a young woman who had understood something about the situation she had entered and was carrying the weight of that understanding without knowing what to do with it yet. Nya looked back at her with the steadiness she had been building her whole life. Not cold, not warm, simply present. She gave the briefest nod. Not forgiveness. She was not going to perform forgiveness she hadn't fully arrived at yet. And Yoon Sera deserved honesty more than she deserved a gesture. Just acknowledgement. You exist. I see you. We are both more than how we were used. Then she walked on. Through security, through the departure gates. Down the long corridor with its moving walkways and its duty-free shops, and its particular quality of suspended time that airports carried, the feeling of being between one thing and another in the passage itself, which was its own kind of place. Gate 47. She sat in the departure lounge while Malik made a call to their father. She sat with her hands in her lap and looked out the floor-to-ceiling windows at the tarmac, at the plane being prepared for boarding, at the sky above Incheon, which was gray and still, and beginning, almost imperceptibly, to lighten. She thought about what came next. Lagos. Her father's house, which smelled of a specific combination of things she had carried in her memory for 12 years. The wood furniture, the spice from the kitchen, the particular light through the courtyard windows in the early morning, her father's voice in a room rather than through a phone. The work, and there would be work, The legitimate financial architecture that had been her brother's project for the last year, and that she was going to build into something real, something that was entirely theirs, built clean and without the concealment that had been necessary here. There would be a life. It would take shape the way lives take shape, slowly, through small decisions, through mornings and evenings, and the gradual accumulation of days that were not strategic operations, but simply days. She was going to be 39 years old in February. She had her mother's photograph and her father's ring, and 12 years of knowledge that had cost her everything. It had cost her and was hers, absolutely. She had done something that could not be undone. She had been something that she had not always known she was capable of being, and had discovered in the process both the limits of that capability and the necessity of it. She was not the woman who had boarded a plane to Seoul at 29. She was not the woman who had stood in that ballroom 3 weeks ago with a champagne glass in her hand and a decision assembling itself below the level of conscious thought. She was something that came after both of those women, something that carried them both and was not reducible to either. The gate agent announced boarding. She stood, picked up her suitcase, walked to the gate and handed over her boarding pass and walked down the jet bridge in the pale morning light. She found her seat, settled in, set her bag in the overhead compartment, sat down and looked out the window at the tarmac, at the gray sky, at the city of Seoul visible in the far distance, the skyline she had known for 12 years, the skyline that had meant home for a long time, and now meant something else, something that didn't need a name yet. Her phone buzzed one last time before she turned it to flight mode. Her father. "We've been waiting for you." She read it, held the phone for a moment, then she typed, "Coming home." She turned the phone to flight mode, set it in her lap, looked out the window. The plane began to move, slowly at first, the particular slow, deliberate movement of something very large beginning to commit to its direction, and then with gathering purpose down the runway, and then the specific moment when the wheels left the ground and the city fell away below, and Seoul was visible for a moment in its full sprawling geography, all those lights, and all those stories, and all that weight of human accumulation pressing up against the river and the hills. And then the clouds came and the city was gone. She leaned her head back against the seat, closed her eyes. In the seat beside her, Malik had already fallen asleep with his long legs stretched out and his head tipped sideways. And he looked, in sleep, like the boy he had been, the 7-year-old working out problems at their father's desk, uncomplicated and entirely himself. And she looked at him for a moment with the particular love of a sister who has known someone's entire life, the love that required no maintenance and asked for nothing. And she felt it like something solid in the middle of all the complexity of everything else. She closed her eyes again. Below the plane, the yellow sea. Then open water. Then the long blue distance between one life and another. She didn't sleep. She didn't need to. She sat in the particular quiet of someone who has finished something enormous and is simply, for the first time in a very long time, still. Not performing stillness, not using it as a tool, simply inside it, breathing, present, alive to the weight and the cost and the strange, hard-won lightness of having survived something at full price and come out the other side knowing exactly what she was made of. The plane flew south and west through the pale winter sky, and Nia Adeyemi, 40 days after she had stood in a garden in Seoul and looked at a tree she had planted in her second year of a life she was leaving, pressed her right hand flat against the window's cold surface and felt the altitude and the distance and the forward motion of something that was, at last, entirely hers, and let herself quietly, without performance, begin.